A year ago, something seismic happened in Bristol. You might think that what happened on the day Edward Colston's statue was brought down was an act of vandalism, a sudden eruption of anger and frustration. But that moment highlighted something stark, that the very history which Edward Colston represented, the history of Britain and slavery, feels incredibly personal to many British people, while distant to many others. I'm Yrsa Daly-Ward, and I'm your guide to this story. I'm no historian, and this is not the history of British slavery. This is Descendants, the series which asks something fairly simple. How close is each of our lives to the legacy of Britain's role in slavery? And who does that mean we are connected to? Every single person's story you will hear is connected, and many of them will bring this history far closer to home than any of us could ever have imagined before. Whoever you are, wherever you are in Britain, the chances are this touches your life somewhere, somehow. Today, I'm going to introduce you to two people whose lives are connected through a moment which helped to create what you now know as Carnival.
My name is Marlon Hibbert. I'm 29 years old and I'm based in Croydon in southeast of the country. London is the place for me. South London is where I want to be.
London is the place for me. London, this lovely city.
But today's story isn't about Marlon's genealogical ancestry. This is the story of what Marlon has discovered about his cultural ancestry, the ancestry of what you could call his other family, and a huge part of his identity today, steelpan.
I am the founder and musical director of Endurance Steel Orchestra, which is a youth-led youth organisation revolving around steelpan.
To help Marlon explain the genesis of steelpan, some archive we dug out of C.L.R. James.
The slaves in the West Indies came from Africa. They were thrown for social life and amusement on their own resources, and for centuries continued to play their drums and other percussion instruments which they had brought from Africa. From the very beginning, the slaves used bamboos as drums and showed extraordinary skill in getting different tones from pieces of bamboo of different size and cut to different lengths.
It's amazing that it actually just started off as untuned percussion.
This was the tambour bamboo, from the French tambour, drum.
So we had taboo bamboo, we had people playing any kind of bits of metal, and then eventually we had the duduk that developed, which was a two-note pan, which was just like in the depths of the ocean, just like doom, doom, boom, doom, doom, boom, doom, doom, boom, doom, and then everything else would kind of form around that. So the people built up these rhythms, so over time more pitches were built into the pan, and to the point where you have what you have today.
But this metamorphosis from drumming to tambour bamboo to metal to tuned drums didn't just happen by accident.
But it came out of oppression.
The tambour bamboo was very noisy, and it could lead to fighting between the bands.
They actually stopped all kinds of celebration, and they stopped people from coming together, and the people who were there found ways of communicating and found ways of doing things, and that came with the rhythm section and tambour bamboo.
After emancipation, freed people established carnival celebrations in Trinidad. And by now, the British had found a new source of labour on plantations in the wake of abolition. They'd begun moving people from British India in a system of indentured labour, which also led to a melting pot of cultural influences and different kinds of carnival celebration. But over and over again, attempts were made to ban music. First, they banned drums, so people began to play bamboo.
In 1881, the chief of police prohibited the tambour bamboo.
Then they banned tambour bamboo, so people began to play pots and pans, until finally they began to experiment with oil drums.
And ultimately it came about. I mean, I don't know if it would have come about otherwise. I don't think anyone would know, but I know that there was people being stopped from doing what they normally do and being able to celebrate, and because of that they found other ways to do it, and over time the instrument developed.
After World War II, word spread beyond Trinidad, and the world got to hear what they had developed by tuning oil drums. Steelpan became a recognised art form.
The steel band affects me in very powerful ways, that it is an art form created by the real plebeian mass of the West Indian people, uneducated in music, some of them uneducated in anything. Since then, it has become not only accepted, but popular all over the world.
The people responsible for trying to ban all of these things were the British colonial police. And this is where you need to meet Valerie.
My name is Valerie Shepherd, and I come from Trinidad. I come from the Caribbean. I grew up as a minority in an island that was predominantly black. I mean, that was how it was. And as I grew up, I wanted to find out more about how did I end up there.
As a white woman who was born in Trinidad, what Valerie discovered was that she ended up there thanks to her ancestor's role in the British police force at the very moment when colonial officials were trying to stop the carnival celebrations.
My great-grandfather was in the middle of it because he was with the police who were clamping down.
Trinidad had been under British rule since before emancipation. But Valerie's family story begins in the 1870s when Sergeant Arthur Shepherd was sent from Chichester in the south of England to Trinidad.
And he seemed to have been seconded to Trinidad to join the police force there. Police force was rather new then, I think. And my great-grandfather would have come. He would have been quite green as a young man in his 20s, leaving a place like Chichester to go to an island of Trinidad, Trinidad was a melting pot. And I think the British were trying to make their presence, and a lot of things were becoming anglicised. And under the British rule, they were bringing law and order, and they were trying to establish all things British. And he was a part of that early movement.
Trinidad was colonised first by the Spanish in the 16th century, then briefly by French settlers in the 18th, before becoming a British colony in 1797.
You know, Carnival was started as a sort of a religious celebration brought by the French. Before Lent, it was the last fling, and they would have fine balls and dances and so on in the upper classes would enjoy it. And I think after emancipation, the lower classes also wanted to have their carnival celebrations. And, you know, they started off by their way of expression was what they knew, which was beating their drums, and they would come on the streets with their flambeaux and the stick fighting, which I think was something that was brought from Africa. It became quite a rowdy and you know, fantastic celebration for them, but I think it got the people in charge, the people trying to keep law and order, a bit nervous, and they wanted to clamp down on it.
1881. The police tried to ban carnival. That didn't go well. It led to rioting. And so then they banned drumming instead.
They managed to control it for a few years, but it was too the power was too much, and I think that was the rebelling.
And so began the story of steelpan.
I tried to put myself back into those times, and I think if you had never been, you know, it's hard for me because I grew up in the Caribbean and I grew up, you know, exposed to all kinds of culture. On the one hand, I can see that it must have been shocking or something completely new to Europeans being there. And on the other hand, There were the people from Africa and the people from not only Africa, but the other lower classes at the time that said, no, this is what we do. This is our music. This is how we want to celebrate. And they stood up for it. And I'm full of admiration for that. And I think that's how it should be. I think that, many of us in that part of the world, we all come from somewhere where, we are transplants. And it's important that we all hold on to our own heritage and be who we are. And that's one of the things that also drives me to find out what happened in those days, because it all forms who we are.
But all this history and the story of what came before, Valerie didn't learn any of it until adulthood.
We knew as children that there had been slaves. We knew that, but we didn't know anything much more about that. We knew that was somewhere in the past. That was nothing to do with us. And I don't know, you know what? I think that islanders have, people from our islands, for a long time there was a sort of I don't know if you would call it a deliberate amnesia or a wish not to speak about things that are unpleasant. That happens even in families. People don't like to recall ancestors who did things that were not as honourable as they should be.
Valerie spent her early childhood in Trinidad, but then her family moved to nearby Barbados, which had a much longer history of British rule.
In Barbados, every school has a school uniform. And very detailed, you have to turn your socks down a certain way and wear certain shoes, and you couldn't be seen on the road without your school hat on. We sang the British anthem, and the education system that I grew up in was very British. And I think that also sort of colours your upbringing, because I never knew anything about Caribbean history growing up. Nothing. We were never taught. So I could tell you all about Henry V and the battle of this and that, but nothing about the very place where we lived. Thankfully, that changed. And so in the next generation, like my children, Caribbean history started to be taught. And it started to bring a lot more awareness of who we are and where we fitted in, but that was only the tip of the iceberg.
Like Marlon, the threads of this history were present in every part of Valerie's life. But, like Marlon, she'd needed to dig deep to find them. Even though, for Valerie, she'd grown up physically surrounded by this history, she'd lived amongst it, spent her life in and around the many old plantation houses and grand buildings that were built during slavery and British rule. Which raises the question, what's the best way to mark the past? How do we make sure we understand how we all got here? Today, Valerie says that in Barbados, people have become much better at recognising the past, and that the physical legacies across the islands have a part to play in that.
I think that these beautiful buildings and these beautiful homes and so on should be preserved to the best that they can. And they can be repurposed to house places for people to come together and talk about the kind of things we're talking about.
One of the old plantations, which has been a big part of Valerie's life, is of particular significance.
During the peak of the sugar revolution, Sunbury House was built around 1660 by the hands of artisan slaves, owned by Matthew Chapman, one of the first settlers on the island. Thomas was
Sunbury is very historic and a real treasure too. That's an example of effort being made to preserve and show people how things were then. What I think is particularly lovely is that many people who were people from black families chose to have their parties at Sunbury, and I thought, how wonderful is that? It was no longer exclusive. This is the kind of thing that I think is so nice to see. I think it's powerful.
I'm Yersa Daly Ward. The producers are Polly Weston, Candace Wilson, and Rema McKenna. The editor is Kirsten Lass. Academic support is from the UCL Centre for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery team. And additional genealogical research is by Laura Berry.